I'm Douglas Biow. I'm the director for the Center for European Studies, as well as the co-director of the EU Center of Excellence. Around 4 years ago, I knew I wanted to get a EU Center of Excellence grant for the Center for European Studies, which had just become a Title VI National Resource Center. And I had the support of the deans, as well as Bob Hutchings, the dean of LBJ, a very strong supporter of the center. But I also knew I needed faculty buy-in, which isn't always easy. So the first person I went to was Jamie Galbraith. I figured if we're going to talk about the EU, and we're going to talk about things related to it, I needed to get his involvement. We sat down. In an hour, he gave me an idea of what kind of a conference he wanted to deliver. I went back, and within a half hour, I had an abstract. I said, could you give me some names? And he sent me the names. So within 45 minutes, I had a conference, which was really quite remarkable that somebody could pull something together so quickly. Well, we had that conference, and it was, I think, a tremendous success, and got some widespread notification or news about it. And shortly afterwards, I turned to Jamie and I said, well, why don't we do another one? And I don't remember his exact response, but I think he smiled and said, well, you can't really pull a hit off twice. Well, fortunately, he decided to do something similar. It's not crisis in the Eurozone 2, but can the Eurozone be saved? And I'm sure this one is going to be equally, if not more so, a success. And I should forewarn him that shortly afterwards I will be asking him, what about Eurozone saved, or can it be saved 3? I give to you, Jamie Galbraith. Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks very much. And let me begin by welcoming all to this second conference at the LBJ School on the crisis in the Eurozone. This one, as Doug has said, is entitled, Can the Eurozone Be Saved? The question condenses, I think, a range of issues that we expect to discuss over the next 2 days. The economic conditions in Europe and the Eurozone today, the politics of change in the European setting, and the question of what should now be done and by whom. This is a transatlantic conference, and it will be, I think, very useful and important to have perspectives from both Europe and America. We have the most distinguished participants here from Germany, from Belgium, from Italy, from Portugal, from Austria, from the UK. And I have possibly omitted, but also I want to say senior leadership from the OECD and from the European Green Party. I do expect, though, that a significant share of our time will be taken up with one European country in particular, and that is Greece, which is has been the cockpit and the fulcrum of the difficulties of Europe and of the Eurozone. And to that end, we are very privileged to have here the leader of the Greek opposition and of the Syriza party, Alexis Tsipras, and several of his colleagues. This is an opportunity for us in America and those watching around the world to see and hear a major voice in Europe's political life today and for the likely future. In that connection, I have a personal note, something of considerable importance to me that I'll just show to you. It's a book. It's a book in Greek. It's a copy of The Affluent Society, written by my father, published originally in the United States in 1958, dedicated in part to me. This particular edition, you can see, is beautifully bound. It's bound actually in used matchsticks held together with shellac. And it's inscribed to J.K. Galbraith, the Democrat, from Democrat prisoners, affectionately bound by Professor G.A. Mangakis, J.A. Papadopoulos, V.A. Papatzitsis, Cote Dallas Prison, summer 1971. So this is a memento of a time when the contest for democracy in Europe was very much a live and vital struggle. And we are now at a moment where the contest for the survival, unity, and prosperity of the Eurozone is perhaps in a similar phase. So I think, and I hope that this conference will provide all of us here with a chance to engage these issues in a very direct and effective way. I want especially to thank my co-organizer of this meeting, Yanis Varoufakis, who has been a vital source on European politics and economics since at least the outbreak of the crisis 5 years ago, and who is now our colleague here at the LBJ School. I would like, as always, to thank the LBJ School and our Dean, Bob Hutchings, for their unstinting support, to thank the Center for European Studies and the European Commission for their support, and to thank the outside sponsors that we've been very privileged to have for this meeting, the Institut Veblen in Paris, the Hans Böckler Foundation, and the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I would also like especially to welcome a group of INET young scholars who are here to listen and participate. If perhaps you could wave up there there you are. Thank you very much. Welcome. Very, very glad to have this group who came here to participate in this meeting. And it may be a bit early at this stage to thank the staff, but it's my opportunity to do so, so I will. Celia Lovett, Lofty Grossman, Lisa Johnson, and my student volunteers, among them Vingier, Beatrice, Peter Lafontaine. This is an event which would not happen without the deeply professional organizing skills that we have here at the school. The work of that group is only partly done, but I am very sure it will be rewarded for all of us by the discussions of the next couple of days. So once again, thank you very much. Welcome. And I will turn the panel over to my colleague, Will Inboden, and the first panelists of the morning.
Could I invite our first panelists to come forward and take your seats of honor here? All right, good morning. Well, as Professor Galbraith said, my name's Will Inboden, and I have the honor of chairing our first panel here at the conference. 2 years ago, I also had the honor of moderating a panel at the predecessor conference to this one, and thinking about Jamie and Doug's prefatory comments just now, I was reminded that 2 years ago, there really was a palpable sense of crisis that hung in the air. And almost maybe even a sense of existential crisis, as the Greece in particular was dominating the headlines. I think just as far as if we can talk about feelings in international politics and international economics, that feeling of crisis is diminished. But one of the things this panel will be addressing is, are we deluding ourselves there? Is the crisis actually over? Or is it just that the feeling of crisis is diminished because of the headline cycle and because we've moved on to new crises with Syria and chemical weapons, with NSA spying, with the latest hijinks from Miley Cyrus and other important geopolitical actors. Now, a disclaimer. I'm neither an economist nor the son of an economist myself. I think we have at least one in here who would fit that bill. I'm a historian. And one thing that historians are fascinated by is these definitions of time frames. The title of our panel here, Is the European Crisis Over? May seem a little mundane. Maybe it's just a yes or no question. We could get a yes or no answer from each of our panelists and then already break for refreshments. But I think the way we define a crisis, and particularly the time frame for it, contains embedded within it a lot of assumptions about causality, about responsibility, about what needs to be done going forward. And historians are still debating the time frames of previous crises. There's still debate over the time frame of World War II. Did it start in 1931 or 33 or 37 or 39 or 41? There's still many debates about the time frame of the Cold War. Did it start in 1945 or 46 or 47 or perhaps back as early as 1917? Did it end in 1963, as some scholars argue? Did it not end until 1989 or 91? The Great Depression itself, again, I could show similar debates. So as we live in the midst of these current travails in the Eurozone, and the question of whether it's a crisis or not, these are very important, not just as academic indulgences, but how we answer this, if the crisis is still ongoing or has it moved into a phase of just a challenge or just a set of problems or maybe a set of opportunities. Within that will contain, I hope, insights on what did cause this in the first place, how do we get out of it, are we out of it yet, what are the prescriptions needed going forward. We have here a very distinguished abundance of panelists, 5 of them. I will refer you to the program guide for their lengthy bios, but suffice it to say we have a range of perspectives here from journalism, from economics, from Europe, from the United States. We've got Joerg Bibow, currently a professor of economics at Skidmore College. We have Thomas Ferguson, currently a political science professor at University of Massachusetts, previously here of University of Texas, Austin, so welcome home. We have Kunibert Raffer, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Vienna. We have Enno Schroeder, an economist with the Institute for New Economic think tank, as well as currently pursuing his doctorate in economics. And then we have Landon Thomas with the New York Times and previously with the investment banking world. So with that, I will turn it over to our panelists. They have all agreed to keep their remarks to a very disciplined time frame of about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a conversation among them and then with you as well. So please welcome our panelists. All right, let's start with George. Okay, that's right.
All right, good morning. Thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to start off this morning panel. Some quick answers. Is the crisis over? I believe not at all. Can the euro be saved? Can the Eurozone be saved? Yes, I do think that's possible, but we would need to really reset the euro, put it on a totally different track. The euro experiment, as we know it, has failed. So what I'm going to do is I will kind of sketch what I call the Euro Treasury Plan, which I believe would be the instrument to put the euro on a new track. It would be what I consider a minimalistic but functional fiscal union to fix the regime. I will, however, first highlight the key flaws in the current euro regime, then very briefly talk about alternative proposals out there before I talk about the Treasury Plan, first as a regime fix, and secondly also I think it would be an instrument to foster recovery. So let me start. What are the key flaws? Well, first of all, the euro regime has proved incapable of dealing with symmetric shocks, so business downturns. Essentially, first of all, in the early 2000s, Euroland took a long time to recover from that, much longer than everybody else. That became, of course, much clearer in the global recession when Euroland had a very hard time dealing with it and hasn't recovered yet. Second kind of flaw, prevention of asymmetric shocks, and in particular of the endogenous variety. So not shocks that really hit countries differently, but shocks that emerge from the system itself. And what I have in mind here in particular is the German wage repression that we have seen under the euro when Germany became ever more competitive and everybody else lost competitiveness, and Germany ran up bigger and bigger current account surpluses and everybody else started running bigger and bigger deficits. So those kind of endogenous asymmetric shocks the system has not prevented at all. Flaw number 3, dealing with financial crises. Well, this is probably the worst of all. Completely defenseless, it turned out, when financial systems came under severe threat. And I think the third point here really highlights the underlying problem with the current euro regime, which is the divorce between the monetary and fiscal authorities. So we have the ECB at the federal level, but we have the national treasuries, which are divorced from their national central bank. So my plan is really to kind of fix this gap, the missing element, the euro treasury, to add that to the regime. Now, what's the problem with that divorce? It really leaves everybody involved very vulnerable. The national treasuries, as we've seen in the crisis, once they get called on to bail out the banking system, we end up with a sovereign debt crisis and no chance for any central bank support in that regard. The national central banks are powerless because they are basically under the control of the ECB, and unless the ECB agrees to emergency liquidity assistance, the national central banks are really powerless. Now, the point that is not so widely acknowledged is that the ECB itself is also very vulnerable. The ECB is vulnerable precisely because it doesn't have a euro treasury by its side. So it's also a very strange situation for the ECB itself, which of course wasn't meant to bail out banking systems and which is prohibited from bailing out governments anyway. But the issue is once the ECB gets involved and may incur some losses, the question arises who's gonna bail out the ECB essentially. So the euro treasury is the missing element, and this I believe was made clear by Charles Goodhart actually before the euro was launched. Now, if these are the main flaws, did the recent regime reforms fix them? Unfortunately, not at all. As far as I can see, the reforms we've had, the so-called Stability and Growth Pact, which was made even stronger, and the Fiscal Compact and the Twin Pact, and all these kind of reforms we have seen, they've actually made things worse, if anything. They focus on more discipline, on adding constraints on national governments, but that by itself does not fix the flaws at all. It makes the system even more vulnerable. It shows, however, that it's all based on the belief that a lack of discipline was the problem to begin with, and that we are really dealing with a sovereign debt crisis. This, however, I think is a complete misdiagnosis of the situation we are in. All right, so what we've done, considering these recent reforms, we are really now trying to have the public sector balance its budget permanently. Now, that's a very odd idea. To begin with, it really defies what we have all believed in for a very long time, which is known as the golden rule of public investment, which should be debt financed, we believed for a very long time. Now we are asking the public sector to balance its books. Now, how is that possible? If you think of a closed economy, private sector, public sector, if the public sector balances its books, it implies the private sector has to balance its books too. It rarely does so, however. It rarely does so. It may be the case at the peak of a boom that the private sector actually runs a balanced financial balance, or even briefly a deficit, but normally it's not the case. And at the moment, I would argue, given that we're coming out of a financial crisis, which saw excessive leverage, so the private sector is delevering, we have a private sector that is aiming for a very large or very sizable financial surplus. So if the private sector is aiming at a surplus and the public sector tries to balance its books, we have a problem. We basically have a recession unless we somehow convince the rest of the world to tolerate the Eurozone to run very large external surpluses. Now, is that really an option? We have to ask ourselves. I think the Eurozone is way too large, the world economy far too fragile for that, and also we've just heard a reminder from the US Treasury that they're not so very amused about what Germany is effectively trying to do, namely turning Europe into a larger Germany that balances its public budget by running huge, persistent external surpluses. Okay, so briefly, the kind of proposals which are out there. The first kind of category is the so-called Eurobonds. So these proposals, and I will not go into details, what they have in common is basically that they aim at reducing borrowing costs, sovereign borrowing costs, or some sovereigns, I should say, by basically buying up existing national public debts and issuing common debt against it. So nothing more than that. Is that a good idea? Well, if it reduces borrowing costs, which have been extremely high for some sovereign, then to that extent it is a good idea. However, as far as I can see, this is only really addressing a symptom of the situation. It's not addressing the underlying regime flaws. So then we have the second set of proposals, and I include here the European Commission's blueprint and the Four Presidents report and the Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa Group's report, also close to the Brussels Circle. So they definitely go further. It's not just about mutualizing public debt. They want some kind of fiscal union, and the kind of fiscal union that they're aiming at focuses on A, more discipline, and B, some element of risk sharing. Risk sharing in the case of asymmetric shocks. Now, this is the aspect which I like about these proposals and which I think will be important, but the trouble with this is that it doesn't go nearly far enough. So it's, again, just addressing one part of the problem, just providing a partial fix. So then we have the third third set of proposals, and I include here the Marshall Plan, for instance, by the Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund, and also the modest proposal. These proposals kind of reject the austerity dogma. They see recovery, stimulus for recovery, as a necessary condition for fixing the crisis, and I fully agree with that approach. However, I also see some serious deficiencies. These approaches, basically two. One is that they include important elements of redistribution, and this is not flying at the time. At this point, there's very strong resistance against any kind of redistribution. And B, I think the financing that these proposals feature is rather clumsy. I think there's a much more straightforward solution to the issue, and I'm now getting to the alternative proposal, which would fix the actual regime flaws, which would secure public investment in Europe, which would establish low borrowing costs for all member states, which would provide effective fiscal discipline. So it looks after all those elements that the other proposals are preoccupied with. It also, at the same time, provides a recovery boost, and it fosters a more symmetric rebalancing as opposed to the current deflationary and very asymmetric rebalancing. It is a fiscal union, a minimalistic fiscal union, but it's not a transfer union. So I'm acknowledging the political reality that a transfer union is not an option at this point. It does give us the Euro bonds that the other proposals want. So it's giving us everything else the proposals want, but I think it's a much more direct, more straightforward, and easier solution. So how does it work? Well, very simply, what I call the Euro Treasury will pool Eurozone public investment at the center and fund it by issuing proper Euro Treasury securities. Very simply. So we can agree here on a fixed rule, say 3% of GDP for the Eurozone, taking the Maastricht criteria. We then increase it 5% every year, so again, Maastricht criteria. The fixed rule, no discretion. The Euro Treasury doesn't do the spending itself. Instead, it gives grants to the national treasuries who do the spending. And the grants are based on countries' GDP shares. At the same time, the Euro Treasury will collect taxes. Taxes to service the debt on, to service the interest on the Euro Treasury debt. And again, this will be based on countries' GDP shares. So there's no redistribution. This is not a transfer union. It's simply a pooling of public investment at the center, funded by issuing proper Euro Treasury securities. Member states, which currently have to balance their total budget balance, will henceforth have to balance their structural current budget, because the capital budget is now separated and it's at the center. If they don't balance their structural current budget, we cut their investment grants. So this is the carrot that is in place here. So what we have effectively is we have continuous deficit spending from the center, funding the public investment. This is essentially based on the so-called golden rule. We are debt financing the public investment we're doing at the Eurozone. We do that at the center, and we split it up according to countries' GDP shares. So instead of relying on the rest of the world to tolerate perpetual external surpluses, we arrange for the deficit spending at the center of the Eurozone to secure public investment and debt finance. So what would happen in the long run? Well, I'm assuming here the Maastricht criteria. At the federal level, we have convergence to the 60% debt to GDP ratio. At the national level, assuming not balanced budgets, but the 0.5 tolerated deficit, which the medium-term objectives currently allow for, we would see the national public debts converge to very low levels, about 10% of GDP. So this is essentially also resembling the US situation at normal times. Key roles: securing infrastructure investment. Oh, I see I'm forced to speed up. Securing infrastructure investment at the center, using straightforward funding for it. It would also anchor the financial system. We would no longer need the ESM, which is a very odd, unwieldy instrument. We'll use the Treasury instead. Thirdly, because the deficit spending at the center will allow the nation states to run very low budget deficits and enable them to reduce their debt ratios, we will actually be in a position where the automatic stabilizers can work at the national level. How is this a recovery program? Well, first of all, it increases public investment spending. Secondly, because members now have to balance their structural current budget, it means immediately less austerity, or in Germany's case, it actually means a big boost because Germany has a balanced overall budget at the moment. We get the indirect boosts as interest rates decline, as soon as the markets acknowledge that national public debts are set on a sustainable trend. And we get a more symmetric rebalancing because the regime implies that Germany is going to see a big boom and hence faster wage price inflation. The ECB should welcome this because they will henceforth have nothing to do with national public debts, which is very complicated, very messy. The ECB will only deal in Euro Treasury securities from now on. The only deficiency, you might argue, well, we're not dealing with the debt overhangs. That is correct. And that is the case, necessarily the case, because this is not a transfer union. So how can we deal with redistribution if by design this is not meant to be a transfer union. Let me wrap up. What we're currently trying to do is based on misdiagnosis and would ultimately blow up the euro as far as I can see. Other proposals only address part of the issue, but are lacking important elements. The Euro Treasury plan proposed here offers a simple and very straightforward solution to the issues. Securing public investment, providing a backstop for the banking union, enabling effective stabilization based at the national level. It is a fiscal union, but it's a very small one. It's just 3% of GDP, but it's basically looking after the essential problem. We reestablish the essential link between the monetary and fiscal authorities at the central level. Thank you very much.
Hi there. It is actually always a pleasure to come back to Texas. Partly, yes, I did teach here and I have many friends here, but it's also one of the few places on earth where the search for the opening joke is not much of a problem. I mean, the heritage here is so rich, it's almost beyond belief. You gotta like a place where, I mean, it's happened to the great-great-grandfather of a friend of mine, comes into Ellis Island, and they ask him, do you believe in the overthrow of the U.S. government by force or violence? And he says, violence. They sent him to Texas. And also, the all-time great statement of the American way of political economy is actually, people don't know this, this quote is little known, but it is true, from Frank Irwin, who was the president here, said to be the babysitter of the place for LBJ, which I won't attest to, but strikes me as probably right. Anyway, there was a dean arguing with Irwin, and he said, Frank, that's a conflict of interest. And Irwin said, hey, where there's no conflict, there's no interest. All right, now, I got just a few minutes, and we all know the issues here are fairly complex. Let me just try to sort of state it, what I think is true. And some of this you just have to, and I'm going to just have to stipulate what I think are the facts, because you just can't possibly look at all the interpretations. And I also should add, since the last time I opened my mouth in the Euro crisis, it ended up in a sort of problem in two countries. I'm not talking for any organization that I belong to. I just tell you what I think. I think, though, the biggest joke of the stuff I've heard recently is actually our first, and I know it's an ironic question, is the Euro crisis over? The answer to that question is perfectly obvious. It is not over. If I had to sort of go for a metaphor, I'd say you're probably in the eye of the hurricane. You just think it's over. Now, what's actually happening? I'll try to sort of sketch it for you. Between Mario Draghi and Mark Carney, you have, I think, enough guarantees to stabilize the banking system. That's why the stuff's dropped out of the headlines. I think any reasonable person that looks at the last 6 or 7 years of headlines and news would quickly find that if there's a problem in the banks, in big banks, there are newspaper headlines. If there are not, then there aren't. And things like high unemployment just don't make it. And you know, that's why you're not seeing the air of crisis. Indeed, there's a kind of officially cultivated doctrine of, it looks remarkably like the green shoots business that the U.S. Federal Reserve and others were sort of pushing forth in 2010. There are people who think the Eurozone's recovering. It is, maybe at a glacial pace. What's actually happening, though, is that you've stabilized the banks with these guarantee, well, they're guarantees, but they're not guarantees. But the claim that, you know, the European Central Bank head just said, well, we'll do whatever it takes. And Mark Carney said last week, we're open for business. Everybody got the point. The banks probably don't fail. On the other hand, you're just sitting at incredibly low levels of aggregate demand with high unemployment. And frankly, there's nothing in the works that looks like that situation will end. You know, we heard until the German election, the Germans can't do anything until after the election. In truth, German elections come along regularly. There are more scheduled. Put it very simply, anyone I think who looks closely at German politics will quickly find there's no real political force there that's likely to take anything like action on the scale and boldness that would be required there. So that makes a pretty interesting situation. You're sort of in stasis, it looks like, economically, and basically you're in the position of looking for shocks. In the meantime, with an absolutely unlivable situation, the truth is that the debts of the southern countries are unpayable. We are at, in some of these cases, we are actually at German reparations levels. And we all know how you get rid of German reparations. They have to ultimately be repudiated, or you got to have a war and force their payment over a very long time and forgive a lot. There just isn't any other way that these debts are going to be paid. They cannot, no one can actually acknowledge this right now. And so we do extend and pretend, as to use the phrase out of the Obama effort earlier, on a colossal scale. Beyond that, you know, the banking union story, which you'd have to do to get very far into a fiscal union and a larger European Union, it's perfectly obvious that the Germans suspect, I think quite rationally, that most of the banks haven't been fixed. And the day after that they agree to a real banking union, the potential obligations will flood by enormous levels. So there's no banking union. There's an impossible debt situation. There's no joint liability in prospect for any kind of a European treasury on any large scale. This is sort of a hopeless situation. And so what happens in hopeless situations? Well, actually, we know this. Unfortunately, we have a lot of experience with this. It's the Great Depression. And my take on this for a long time has been the real lesson of the Great Depression is this, is that you get into a deep hole. People just talk. It may or may not make the headlines. You know, it drops in, drops out. You believe this or not, in the spring of 1930, people thought the economy was reviving. But then nothing really gets done. And then you get deep-seated political change. The first response is invariably in, out, in. You just start changing parties. Then after 3 or 4 years, you see civic order really breaking down in large amounts. Sometimes you will see industrial groups at that point breaking ranks. I think that may now be happening in France, if I read Francois Heisberg's latest book correctly. And so then, in effect, the swamp creatures start coming out. Now, it does not help that in this crisis this time around, the socialist parties have behaved like, frankly, well, like they did actually in the early 1930s. I hate to say it. They're just brain dead. It was a huge mistake for all the folks sort of sitting in that so-called Socialist International or the other parties in Europe to cheer on the Greek efforts to meet the early demands of the creditors. I think people sort of should acknowledge that. The one chance you probably had to sort of nip this crisis in the bud would have been very early. After that, as we all know, the costs of trying to deal with these things just mounts. But the socialist parties have been brain dead. What you can see happening just about everywhere is thus a turn to alternatives. In some cases, further left parties. But in many cases, you know, in the National Front in France is now said to be projected to be the largest winner in the coming European elections. That's going to vault that party into national prominence and give them sort of institutional roots they haven't had. In Spain, inside the Popular Party, there is clearly a sort of Francoist revival going on in parts of it. I don't need to talk about Greece. You can read about it in the newspapers. But this is your situation. I mean, basically, if you can't find a reasonable way to get people employed, people of all ages, but you know, the youth unemployment situation is catastrophic. It's just overwhelming, and people are just leaving countries with no future. If you can't find a way to get folks employed, eventually somebody will come along. And I fear, therefore, the answer to this question, is the Eurozone crisis over? No, it's not. You're just sitting in a kind of hurricane-like eye, a weird equilibrium, waiting for the shock. It'll come from somewhere, you know, Greece maybe, Italy, Spain, Portugal, could even be France, which I mean, it's clear to me that if you look in the suburbs in France now, the civic order is essentially broken down, with even the police being more unwilling than anyone admits to go in there. I mean, Europe's quietly rotting out, and the political crisis is plainly building. You know, and there's only one way to head this kind of stuff off, which is you've got to take some really serious economic measures. I think, I regret to say, the chances of that are not great. So it's we're sort of returning to that sort of terrible situation. You know, do you believe in the overthrow of the euro by force or violence? I trust not violence, but I bet it's not a totally orderly process either.
Well, looking over my notes there from Professor Ferguson, let's see, we had brain-dead socialist, catastrophic youth unemployment, Europe rotting out, a hopeless situation, a crisis building. Now for a pessimistic take, we'll hear from Kunibert Raffer. So, anyway, thanks. All right.
Can anyone help me? I'm not so literate on this. Oh, thank you. That was an easy one. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here, Jamie, and the organizers, Yanis. It's always a pleasure to talk here at this university in Texas, and the topic is also something I, unfortunately, as a European, quite connected to. Now, the question is answered quite easily, I would say. The question would be answered quite easily, but I am afraid I have to join Thomas. I also think it is not over yet, and it might well get worse if you look at the way that EU politicians have managed the crisis so far. I think it can only get worse in practically any respect. And what I think is that the effects of neoliberal austerity policies are likely to last for quite some time. I have nothing to add to what you said about youth unemployment, etc. So the euro crisis will be with us for the next couple of years, I'm afraid. The first point, I think there was no need to save the euro or the Eurozone in the first place. And politicians maybe have exaggerated the threat to the currency. The US is also a currency union. There are bankrupt states. California is just the best known of them. And this morning, at least, the dollar still existed. I don't know the present situation. So the threat to the dollar by bankrupt states is, in my view, about the same threat to the Eurozone by bankrupt member states, which is none. But the neoliberal crisis is an excellent pretext to further enhance neoliberalism, which has always puzzled me. Because normally, if someone really messes up, then you don't trust him or her with going on messing up even more. But here, the neoliberal crisis serves as an argument why you have to have more neoliberalism. And in two words, so to say, to sum it up, it's Predator State, the title of Jamie's book, where certain lobbyists or classes have succeeded in using or abusing the state, the government, for redistribution of income, of wealth in their sense. And this is, I think, the really important point. Now, there are, of course, demands to undo the present Eurozone. I've only mentioned one because it is distinguished from all the others by one interesting feature. This feature is that the Germans and the other, so to say, strong states should leave first. Normally, you hear the demand that the so-called weak states should leave the Union first. But this is another one. But you see, there are people who think that the Eurozone might break up. And as I said, given politics as they are in the EU, one cannot not exclude it, although I think that it is not really the biggest danger. What are the dangers ahead? I'm very skeptical of Eurobonds because they would institutionalize the very problem that led to the crisis. The problem, namely, that in spite of the no bailout clause, the interest rate for some countries was too low and encouraged these countries or made it possible for them to heap too much debt on their countries. Now, this can only work, all these Eurobonds, stability bonds, etc., proposals, if you have governments and parliaments subjected to authoritarian control by the EU, by the EU Treasury or whatever, which means by increasing what's called the democracy deficit in the EU even further. You would, in the end, I think, abolish democracy for good if you allow unelected bureaucrats to determine the budget and to infringe on the budget right of elected parliaments. And you would do it for good, or as I have made the remark, in my humble opinion, rather for bad. Now, the danger to democracy and the strengthening of the neoliberal redistribution policies is the really big danger in my view. And what is needed, on the other hand, is what I call a EU recovery program, EURP, which fights present austerity policies and their effects, or as the IMF put it so much more learnedly than I could, the fiscal multiplier problem, which at the moment is also one of the big problems of the way the crisis is treated and managed. Now, I have found an example of what could be done. Now, don't cherish yet, it would be cream what's follow, it's just land. But look at Iceland. They had a big crisis, a bigger crisis, relatively speaking, than many Euro countries. If you look at the relation between the debts of just 3 banks and the GDP of Iceland, and what happened there? They did not do what the IMF usually tells countries to do. They introduced capital controls. They had 2 referenda on whether to pay all the debts to the private sector or not. The fiscal policy, most notably, was not tightened. It was even, just a bit, but it was even an increase in social outlays in the first period of the crisis. And within 3 years, roughly, Iceland was back to international capital markets. Now, look at the figures of the last report of the IMF on Iceland, and one sees a very clear improvement of the present figures compared with the peak values of things like unemployment, inflation, etc. The ratio of gross reserves, short-term debt looks quite good. But if you don't obey the IMF, if you're a bad boy or a bad girl, you know, punishment is lurking behind the corner. Downside risks, according to the IMF, prevail. And we'll just see what's the real big problem those Icelanders have to cope with in the near future, according to the IMF. We see Iceland, by spending too much money on the people, will not have a balanced budget in 2014. Now, this, of course, floored me, like it might floor any one of you, because we all know the US, Germany, Austria, you name them, they all have balanced budgets already. The Icelanders, by not following the IMF, apparently will not even be able to have a balanced budget in 2014. These are the fruits of not obeying the IMF. A bit earlier than the last report of this year by the IMF was quite positive about Ireland, and even went that far to say that Ireland set an example what to do. And this example was precisely the opposite of what had been done in the EU in the case of the Eurozone countries. Now, there is a quote which I would like to share with you by the President of Iceland, and he puts things very much in a nutshell. What should prevail, democracy or the demands of the market? What should you do? His reply to that was very simple. You know, there were 2 referenda in Iceland about the payment of the debt. Iceland has paid some of the debts of the banks, but by far not all of them. What should be done? First, the rule of law. Article 125 should have been kept, the no bailout clause, and it would have worked, it could have worked if you also had a sovereign insolvency model, a sovereign insolvency procedure. What can be done? Debts have to be reduced to a manageable level. I won't talk about the RAFA proposal. I had the honor of doing this the last time I was here. Austerity policies have to be stopped. Banks should pay their bailout by themselves rather than by the taxpayers. Owners and creditors of insolvent banks, as in any normal insolvency procedure, would have to carry the burden first. There was a first step in the case of Cyprus. No more sweeteners as in Greece, I'm coming to this. Re-regulation, making the no bailout clause credible, disconnecting creditworthiness from credit rating agencies, and especially repeal institutionalized anti-Keynesianism, such as the Maastricht criteria, the six-pack, etc. What's meant by sweeteners? Zettelmeier, Trebesch, and Gulati have described that those people holding Greek instruments at the time of when debt management started were getting unusually good conditions. And to the point that the authors even are afraid that this might make any similar action or debt management as at large for European countries more difficult in the future. And we see the IMF had considerate misgivings, according to itself, in going along, but was pressed along by the European Union that was just unwilling to pay more or unwilling to accept a debt reduction or restructuring right at the beginning. Now, this is a very simple thing. As you can see, if you don't cut unpayable debt in the beginning, it will just grow. And in the end, you end up by having on your paper, I'm just about to end, you have on your paper debts that do not exist in reality. You have it on the paper, but they won't be paid. They have no economic underpinning, so to say. And just to show this in the case of Greece, what would the losses of the private sector have been? According to the financial press, the first haircut, the loss was 75%. Zettelmeier, Trebesch, Gulati have a different perception according to the way they calculate the present value. If the first proposal by Gross and Meyer, 50% cut, and then Greece would have been afloat again, it would have been 50%, much less. If you had a proper insolvency procedure, it would be 50 or something similar. And in the last two cases, Gross-Meyer and my own proposal, there would have been no taxpayers' money lost, and there would have presumably less losses than at present for anyone. But as we can see, if you compare these figures, apparently EU politicians did what they could to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we have Enno Schroeder.
Yeah, hello. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving one of the young scholars the floor here. That's very unusual for such a high-profile event, so thank you very much. I'm pleasantly surprised how quickly this is the first gig for me of such a big high-profile event, and I'm pleasantly surprised how quickly one is referred to as a distinguished panelist. And that's very nice. So my presentation... my presentation today is going to be an extract of my dissertation. Currently, I'm writing my dissertation at the New School for Social Research, and the comparative advantage of old and wise people clearly are the big picture questions. I will confine myself to a much more narrow question, and I want to address the question whether the diagnosis of the problem is correct. And Mr. Schäuble believes that we are now beginning to reap the fruits of the structural reforms in the peripheral countries. And because, yeah, the peripheral countries are now adopting essentially the policies that have that Germany has adopted in the mid-90s, mid-2000s, early 2000s, the so-called Hartz reforms. And if other countries follow on similar path and they also exercise fiscal restraint, we are going to see light at the end of the tunnel, and soon the crisis will be over. Of course, we still have catastrophic unemployment rates in the periphery, and the crisis is not nearly over. Also, there is a gigantic mountain of debt that hasn't been dealt with. Lots of people have made lots of promises, and these debts are never, ever going to be repaid. So the crisis is definitely not over. But I want just to focus on the question of unit labor costs, which are supposedly at the heart of the matter. And my main message is the unit labor cost divergence is a red herring. And so I want to persuade you today that essentially the low-wage policy in Germany has led to expenditure reduction, which is not so hard, I believe, to convince you of that, but it has led to very little expenditure switch. And so the competitiveness channel of the unit labor costs is overrated, that I want to convince you of. And to set this in context, the terms that Mario Buti is using in this slide, they come from the post-war literature, international macro literature. And so you see here an accounting identity, and it suggests that a country, let's say in deficit, can get its trade surplus by either reducing expenditure or inducing agents, domestic and foreign agents, to purchase out of a given volume of expenditure more domestic goods. And boosting exports and output, I label the high road to a surplus, and dampening expenditure and imports, I label the low road to a surplus. Germany has taken the low road, that I want to convince you of. And this is really I have tried many ways to explain this as simply as possible. This is the only slide with equations, and I will walk you very quickly through it. And I'm not going to present any model. I'm just want to show you a way of looking at data. Because the question, how large is the competitiveness effect and how large is the aggregate expenditure effect in the determination of trade balances, usually is addressed with trade elasticities in the literature, but nobody believes in trade elasticities. They are quite a flimsy foundation for policy making, I would say, because the econometrics never are going to deliver a precise point estimate. In any case, so I'm doing an accounting decomposition, and domestic expenditure is a concept from national accounts. It's equal to absorption or domestic demand, and we can just extend this. We can write imports are imports divided by domestic expenditure times domestic expenditure. That's an identity. And then we say imports and imports divided by domestic expenditure I call the import propensity. And then we say imports are the import propensity times domestic expenditure. It's very simple. One note on the import propensity, it's rising in almost every country. That's globalization, in particular the integration of production chains across borders. We can do the same for the foreign country, and exports are just the foreign import propensity times foreign expenditure. And since the import propensities are both rising, it's much more interesting to look at the ratio of the two, which one rises faster. And if we put everything together, we have decomposed the trade ratio, which is exports over imports, into the terms of trade, expenditure switch, and relative expenditure volumes. And then we can assign numbers to these and look how large are these effects. And it's very simple to assign numbers to these. These are concepts from conventional national accounts. The only thing which needs some thought is what is foreign expenditure. And I'm using a trade-weighted indicator of foreign expenditure. So for example, for Austria, Germany would weigh very high. For Ireland, the UK would weigh very high. The weights also vary over time. In any case, here's how it looks over time. So the black line is relative expenditure, foreign expenditure over domestic expenditure. The expenditure of German trading partners over German expenditure. We see here the development from 1990 to 2010. And you see during the unification boom, German expenditure was growing faster, but after that it was slacking relative to its trading partners. And you see on the right, you see Spain, which has gone through this enormous expansion, which then came to an end during the crisis. France and Italy, they look very similar. The relative expenditure was essentially rising throughout almost the entire period. But the trade ratio, or the trade balance too, was declining from the late 90s. So that implies a negative expenditure switch, an unfavorable expenditure switch. Since the scale of these graphs is such that we best see the time series variation, underneath, when we want to look at the magnitudes involved, we have to actually look at numbers, and I present some tables. So here is a cumulative change in expenditure switch during the Euro period. And we see that nearly all European countries have suffered an unfavorable expenditure switch. And there are differences in degree. I would say that France and Italy stand out. I call them the competitiveness laggards. And Ireland here looks like a healthy catch-up economy. You would assume that, a healthy catch-up economy balances its huge expenditure growth by a favorable expenditure switch. However, the balance of payments data of Ireland is riddled with so many problems due to the presence of multinationals and transfer pricing schemes and so on. I don't really know how to interpret the Irish data. And this is the cumulative change of relative expenditure. And here we see the extraordinary slack in German expenditure. It turns out that the indicator of foreign expenditure is actually not quite similar across countries. That is the effect of fiscal restraint over a decade and longer, about 2 decades, and low wage policy over 2 decades, essentially, or 15 years. Your trading partners grow much faster than you. That is one way towards a trade surplus. I jump over this slide. Here I want to show you that had German expenditure grown as fast as the trading partner expenditure, Germany would be running a trade deficit. Okay, so I just want to point out a couple of reasons for why unit labor costs maybe don't matter so much. Okay, 1 minute. So yeah, we are always presented with a graph like the change in unit labor costs against the change in the current account and things like that. I'm actually a little bit suspicious of all these correlations, but here I just present the export growth on the vertical axis and the change in unit labor costs on the horizontal axis, and you see there is hardly any correlation, but that should be really the correlation that we should be observing if prices are such a big competitiveness factor. And so just maybe 1 point. There's a difference between our theoretical priors. We believe that relative prices induce expenditure switch. But then we have observational variables like unit labor costs. And just 2 things, two points. So for example, we know from the literature on firms and international trade that firms are extremely heterogeneous, and the more productive ones, the more skill-intensive ones, the the ones that pay higher wages are the ones that are in the business of exporting and importing. And in Spain, for example, only 8 or 12% or so of firms are actually exporting. But unit labor costs, they are measured in the aggregate. And there's no reason to believe that the firms that are subject to international competition are undergoing the same process. Their productivity development might be quite different. And for example, the Bank of France has done a paper on the unit labor cost indicator, showing that essentially it was the development in the non-traded goods sector which accounts for the bulk of the increase in the unit labor cost in the periphery. So the relevant price vector is smaller, the divergence is smaller than we believe. And another point is also the incidence of German part-time work has jumped up, and the unit labor costs are calculated on per head, which deflates the German numbers. So the divergence is smaller than we are led to believe. Okay, so yeah, to wrap up, I think I was pretty clear on most of my points, and I'm running out of time. So I wanted to convince you that Germany has taken the low road to external surpluses. And yeah, we might question whether that is desirable, whether there's anything that we can learn from that. Of course, we get a trade surplus by expenditure restraint. But that's, from my perspective, not a particularly desirable policy. And yeah, I'm just going to stop here. Thank you.
And our final panelist is Landon Thomas.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'm just going to speak right here, so when you send those nasty notes up there, you can just slide it right over here.
Smiley faces on these. So, brilliant point.
Exactly.
So
right.
Time is up. All right.
So I have I'm not sure if it's the privilege or the burden of being the only non-economist on the panel here. I consider it a privilege, actually, because as my editors tell me, a journalist keeps it simple, keeps it short, and uses other people's work quite shamelessly, which I will do, and cite them as well. So, you know, I've been covering this crisis for 5 years or so. I've read a lot of work by a lot of really smart people, a lot of amazing plans, some of which we've seen here, which have a lot of merit. A few papers stuck in my mind from a few years ago, and I'll cite the names Charles Wiplos and Randall Henning, who I don't know these people actually, but I came across their papers because, and I took note of them because they explained what was going on in Europe within the context of what's going on in the U.S. And since we're here in the U.S. and in Texas talking about the Eurozone, I thought it would be a good starting point. And what they do, and I guess it's Randall Henning who really makes this point by going back and looking at what the states did in 1790 when George Washington came into power and Alexander Hamilton, his first Treasury Secretary, had to figure out how to pull these disparate states together and form a union with buy-in. I mean, how do you do that? The states were running deficits, huge debts. There was no sense of sort of community. So how did he do that? And if you read the sort of the history here, and I would commend the book by Ron Chernow on Alexander Hamilton as probably one of the best things you can read on the Eurozone crisis. What they did is they got somehow the states to buy into the concept that they needed to manage their financial books on their own and own that. That took time. It took a lot of time. And it's the constant sort of refrain in Europe. How do you get a Greece? How do you get a Spain? How do you get any country to understand that it's its own responsibility, it's its people's responsibility to balance spending and revenue? It's at the heart of the crisis with Greece. So the other thing that they mention is that, you know, there's no bailout. There's no bailout rule in the U.S. Constitution or in any sort of law that you can find. It's just known and understood that when a U.S. state blows up, it's not going to get bailed out. So we went back, we looked at that, or he looked at that, and some interesting things happened. From 1790 on, the federal government made a decision to assume and restructure the debts of these, the profligate states. There were 13 or so then, I guess, and I'm not sure which ones they were. But the decision was made, to a lot of hue and cry in opposition, we will take responsibility for these states' debts. There was a restructuring, believe it or not. I mean, if you look at it, it looks almost sort of, going back to PSI, the original PSI. There was, people took losses. And from then on, from 1790 or so, up until the present day, there have been states that have gone bankrupt. But from the period of time after the Civil War, there were no bailouts. And now pretty much every single state, or most states, I think, have enshrined in their constitution this idea that you need to balance your books. Now, I'm not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just stating this as fact. So why did that strike me? Well, then I looked, and I was looking around at the debt to GDP, which is sort of this great ratio that we all become obsessed with, and it turns out that the states have debts to GDP which are relatively small. And this is, again, I'm citing the work of Wyplosz and Henning, 7% of GDP. I think the debt to GDP of Texas is 13 or 14% of GDP. But a principle was established, which is that the states take responsibility and ownership of managing their own economic affairs. Sometimes they mess it up, sometimes they succeed, but it is their responsibility. Now, to be sure, there is help from the federal government, most importantly at the onset, assuming the debt. So taking that as sort of an opening principle, I'm going to sort of share with you a couple of anecdotes just that you come across as a reporter. About 2 weeks ago, Prime Minister of Greece came to the New York Times, Mr. Samaras, very eager to say, look, this is what we want to do, and we want to tell the world that we're doing our successes. And for about a half hour, he spoke with, pretty impressive degree of granularity and expertise on the primary surplus, what was being cut, what was, this line item, that line item, going way over the heads of the publishers and editors. But for me, I was saying, wow, this is, I can't imagine a head of state sort of engaging with this degree of specificity on the primary surplus and how you're balancing your books and all that. And he, I got the sense that he was proud of this. It wasn't so much he was doing this because Europe said you had to do it. I got the sense that he said, look, 5 years ago we had a primary deficit of 10%. Now we're down to 0. And he took pride in that. Now, you can disagree or agree with how he got there, but I saw ownership there. A few weeks later, I was in Washington, and Olli Rehn was going around talking about, what Europe has done. And he said one thing at one of these panels. He said, look, let me say it simply, conditionality works. Now, again, I'm not disagreeing or agreeing with whether that's right or not, but you take what he said and you take what I saw with Samaras, and it takes you to a certain place, which is, over the past 4 or 5 years, you've had these incredible achievements with regard to cutting spending and increasing revenues. There's been awful social consequences as well. At the same point, you have another data point that is really important. Greece's debt at the beginning of the crisis was, say, 120% of GDP. Now it's 170% of GDP. Every single country that has reduced its primary surplus by a significant amount has also seen its debt to GDP skyrocket. So we have achievement on one side of the ledger, very solid fiscal progress, in some situations like Greece, historically unprecedented. On the other side, you see the debts shooting up. So where does that leave us? I think it takes us all the way back to 1790. Because what if whoever it is that makes decisions in Europe these days, maybe it's the next Alexander Hamilton, what if whoever it is says, look, as long as countries can take responsibility of their economic situation without Europe telling you what to do, whether it's a constitutional amendment, whether it's putting it in some form of legislation. We will reduce your debts by X%. Then you would have ownership, and then you would have debt reduction. So in Italy would not have debt to GDP of 150%. It would be, I don't know what, 100 or so. Greece, the same. It's just an idea. But I think if you look at history, you know, some ideas are hard, but they're also simple. So that's really what I have to say, and I think we've been here for quite a while, so why don't I give it back to the chairman and he can kick it off for questions.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Landon. Thank you especially for that incredible self-discipline on the use of time, maybe a model for states and their fiscal self-discipline. So at least he's practicing what he's preaching there. We want to open it up to the audience very soon, since I know there's going to be a lot of questions and responses to some of the very insightful presentations we've heard here. I did want to give our panelists a chance to respond first, though. Any of you have any responses you want to say to each other for remarks you heard, or questions you want to put to each other, or?
Yeah, I'd like to ask, I mean, that was on your, yeah. Sorry, okay. I mean, so with regard to, I mean, I was interested when you mean that the German expenditure is taking the low road. So what exactly, what is the sort of the lesson if you're presenting this paper to Olli Rehn or someone? What should a policymaker do if they say, you know what, great paper, now we're going to do what we have to do?
So I argue that the German success on world markets, the development of the exports, was very little the effect of the low-wage policy. And so the lesson is that you don't, like in the case of Germany, you don't have to fear losing export market shares a lot if you let your wages rise a little bit. And
so then a country like Greece should, I mean, if their wage costs are now going down a lot and people are proud of that, you should say, well, we shouldn't be so proud of that, yes, right?
It's a little bit difficult also to transfer it to the other countries because the product mix is different there. But I do say that Spain, for example, doesn't need to adjust its labor costs downwards in order to have its exports grow. Spain was able to actually, like Austria and Germany during the Euro period, to maintain its world market shares almost. So, yeah, the competitiveness effects of the wage changes are very small. And that's also one reason is that, I mean, they are small relative to the changes in the nominal exchange rate. That is something like through that channel, you can get changes in relative prices in the order of 50%, 100%, sometimes even more. But these like 5% changes, 10% changes, I don't think that they matter a lot in a world where the products are highly diversified, very complex, and not homogeneous. And so that's one lesson.
Thanks. And if I can tee up the first question before we do turn it over to the audience side. Concerning the relationship between the economic challenges here and the political challenges, Professor Raffer, you in particular alluded to concerns about a growing democracy deficit in the EU and making sure that whatever economic solutions are promulgated do not further the democracy deficit. Landon, in some ways, your comments are also getting at concerns about the possibility of the democracy deficit. I just wonder how much do you think that might be playing a role in the current crisis, and how much is that at the forefront of policymakers' concerns, making sure that doesn't worsen?
Well, I think
if you look at the way that the management of the crisis has been done, there seems to be one of the major aims of the politicians to move away the economy and the control of the economy from elected representatives of the people. And the expression democracy deficit is not my word. It has been invented, I don't know by whom, in the EU decades ago, I might say. It has always been a very clear distinction of the European Union, and it's getting worse. And to my understanding, it is very clear, because if you have, as in Iceland, say, a referendum on certain things, the majority might definitely not agree. If you had a referendum in Greece, the majority would not agree with the policy that's being practiced in Greece right now. And of course, Germany, France, they were all against the referendum in Greece when Papandreou, I think it was, at the beginning of the crisis, proposed to have a referendum. Immediately it had to be called off, because democracy, if there are really democratic decisions, a different economic policy would be demanded and would be necessary.
Any other comments on that? Should we turn it over to the audience? Ask the audience. All right, great. Okay, we're happy to take any questions. We do ask that you keep them to questions, and if there's a pontification in there, just keep it short. So, all right, yes. Oh.
The European Union is in trouble. Might I suggest there's another union in great difficulty? It's called the Federal Union, or the United States. And I would be interested to hear from the panelists, in brief compass, of course, to what extent the internal political crisis of the United States, particularly over debt, budget, balance of state and market, role of the federal government versus the states, is a parallel to, in some sense, the Eurozone crisis, and what connections might subsist between it. That should provide material for brief and cogent answers.
That's right. So, anyway. All right, any of our panelists on the political crisis in the United States?
Well, if you want, I'll say something.
Yeah, please do. That's right.
Look, every time aggregate demand fails in a big way, you have a political crisis. I mean, it's even reached the point now where I can hardly believe this. John Taylor actually arrived at that conclusion. That's true. And, you know, fundamentally, those deep crises in both Europe and the United States come from governments running way below full employment and sitting there in a sort of absolutely classic underemployment equilibrium. And, you know, and the political crisis in the U.S. basically boils down to the failure of the Obama stimulus program. It was half-sized, and they were then blown away in the congressional elections, and one of the biggest seismic shifts in American election history. It's right up there among the top 5 or 6. And it also changed the landscape in a lot of state legislatures. I mean, it's quite a comprehensive, and in 2012, though Obama managed to win the election, has not effaced all the sort of the deep structural changes that went on there. We're still living with them. And aggregate demand failure, yeah, you only need really one explanation for one giant crisis in each country. And in Europe, it's plainly an aggregate demand failure too. Until people deal with it like that, neither crisis is going to go away.
May I add to that? So I think there seems to be a parallel between what's happening in the US and Europe, and the parallel, to the extent it exists, is purely ideological. It's about austerity. Otherwise, I think there is no parallel at all. In the US, it's purely a political crisis. The US has all the institutions to deal with the situation. My point is that Europe does not, or the Eurozone does not have. The Treasury is missing. That's the fundamental difference. So if the US, for some reason, tries to balance the budget or not increase the debt ceiling and those kind of things, these are just acts of political stability. They're not anything institutional. In Europe, the issue is real. We don't have the Treasury. We have the national treasuries, which do not have a central bank by their side, and we have the federal central bank, which doesn't have a Treasury by its side. And that is the institutional flaw in Europe. It doesn't exist in the US.
I might just add that no matter how the U.S. tries to screw things up, it always manages actually to stumble along quite successfully compared to Europe, and growth is better. And despite all the drama about the deficit here and what to cut, what not to cut, the last budget deficit figures are quite impressive. They're coming down to quite manageable levels, down from I think 10% to I'm not sure what it is, but it's been an improvement that took many by surprise. So there's I think that's what you see when you have a country where as George says, the institutions are there. That helps a lot.
All right. Well, hearing Landon's comment about how America has perhaps been lucky or fortunate, I'm reminded of the remark attributed to Bismarck. A lot of things are that God has mercy on fools, drunks, and the United States of America. So, question here.
Thank you. It's a technical question for Ando. I was quite intrigued by your work because, I mean, if it may be applicable to Germany, this idea of country that has a control over its terms of trade, I doubt it, because from a global standpoint, Germany is a small country. But all the others are certainly small. And if they are small, the appropriate model is the Australian so-called model, rather than the terms of trade, is the relative price of traded and non-traded goods. And that changes some of the conclusions, because, of course, a country very often, when it's small, it doesn't export more because it actually consumes the goods that it could export. So the analysis is quite different. I think that you rightly emphasized expenditure reducing as opposed, expenditure switching as opposed to expenditure reducing. But the framework of the relative prices, I think, needs to be addressed. I give you a reference that has done that. Some work by Penticori, who is Finnish, but used the Australian model, actually is interesting because it also includes limits on the exports, which occur, of course, if the world economy is not as, is not growing sufficiently fast, which is certainly the case in the last few years. So I believe that the kind of conclusion that you made should really be checked against this traded and non-traded goods model. And one last point is Marco Butti, not Mario Butti.
Well, I will just, I'm happy to talk to you later and get that reference. It relates, of course, to what is the price-setting behavior of firms in large countries and small countries. And I mean, in the debate here in the Eurozone, it is just across the board assumed that there is some kind of markup pricing because otherwise the unit labor costs would have a more flexible relationship also to prices. And it is in that debate I want to address, and that I take as given.
Could I make a quick comment? I just got yesterday evening the new paper by Service Storm and C.W. Nastapad on relative unit labor costs. I think it's the best thing done yet, with the possible exception of Anno's. And it's right in the Anno's conclusion. I think the relative unit labor cost business needs a very careful look, but my suggestion is as the Storm and Nastapad paper becomes known, you'll think about this question in a new way. They come to effectively the same ground as Anno in a different way.
Go ahead, George.
If I may add to that, I think it's somewhat superficial to divide the expenditure switching and reduction and pretend it's the one only and not the other. I've always argued that it's both things happening at the same time. If you have wage repression, cum fiscal austerity in Germany, then you have stagnating incomes, so consumption and imports will stagnate along with that. But at the same time, you have Germany becoming more competitive. So you have it happening at the same time, and the important issue here is to understand within the Maastricht regime, if you have domestic demand stagnation in Germany, Germany being a big chunk of the Eurozone, you get a response from the ECB, because to some extent even the ECB responds to growth. So you get the ECB interest rate reduction, which is too little for Germany, but too much for Spain and Portugal and so on. And you have the what I call the endogenous asymmetric shock, because it's continuing to depress Germany and it's stimulating the periphery. So the process becomes feeding on itself.
I guess what is if Germany was to read your paper and say, oh, okay, let's do something to sort of take care of this problem, what would they do? Would they just start spending more, or what exactly would they just say, okay, everyone's got a big pay increase of 20%, let's go to the malls and have some fun, or what exactly, what's the sort of...
Well, for Germany, yes, I recommend let's go to the malls and have some fun. Because, as I said, the competitiveness effects of the cost divergence are overrated, and Germany can afford to have some fun because it doesn't face any external constraint.
So 20% pay increase, then you know, well, how much does how much can they go up, did you say?
Well, I haven't done that analysis, but they can go up as much until they hit a balance of payments constraint. That's the idea. You run an expansionary policy until you run into any constraint. It must not be only the balance of payment constraint, there can be other constraints. But yeah, I want to address your comment. It's of course true that the unit labor cost, they have two sides. I mean, there's the expenditure side. It's more wages. You can take productivity there out of the picture. And then there's a competitiveness side. What I like in particular about this is that, I do say Germany has taken the low road, take that as rhetoric, I want to get my point across, but what I like about this analysis is that it can quantify, those two dimensions. It can quantify the expenditure switch, and it can quantify the relative expenditure volume effect. And so far, we were not really able to say, okay, how much of the Germans export, low-wage policy, how much did it help Germany, in terms of expenditure switch?
The trouble is you have empirical analyses coming out of the Commission and the Bundesbank which show the exact opposite. They show that German expenditure doesn't matter at all. So German stagnation didn't matter for these developments, and a huge German boom wouldn't matter at all either. So you can, empirically, I think you have some flexibility to prove your case, and therefore I think in practical terms you have to just have to acknowledge that both factors are at work, and the important thing is within the Maastricht regime it gets amplified because you get the common monetary policy which depresses Germany further when wages stagnate, which stimulates Spain because wages and incomes are rising at a normal rate. Plus, you get the Stability and Growth Pact on top of that, right? If you have stagnation, Germany will have problems with the stupid pact. So you get fiscal austerity in Germany. In Spain, you will have a balanced budget. They even had a surplus. So you get tax cuts, which stimulate spending. So you get the divergence. That's the endogenous asymmetric shock, which is the important point.
We've got Kuenenberg's been waiting in line, and then we've got a question over here. So Kuenenberg first, and then
coming back to those internal imbalances. Of course, what happens if there's a huge surplus in very few countries, or maybe only one country in the Eurozone? I mean, that surplus, of course, has to be invested somewhere. It doesn't go into wages in the country, so it goes somewhere else. Of course, there's German investment in the US, for instance, but a large chunk of that surplus went, of course, into the southern periphery, and was creating the debts there to some extent too. And I do have a problem with your point about the lack of a treasury. I think quite on the opposite. If you had really kept to the 125 of the former Lisbon Treaty, it's now been repeptized a bit, and had a cut of unpayable debt, which is necessary sooner or later anyway, the same would substitute for a treasury. And I somewhat disagree with the no bailout clause in the US, because in my understanding, the 11th Amendment to the Constitution is something like a no bailout clause that has, I agree, always been obeyed. And it works, yes.
All right, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the floor for a minute. Just two remarks. My name is Heiner Flassbeck. I'm coming in later. And two remarks. First of all, on the substitution effect or expenditure switch effect, I think it's a very academic debate. If you turn it into political terms, you would say, well, if you don't have the expenditure reduction effect, then it takes 20 years to kill your neighbor by a devaluation, as Germany has done. If you have it, it takes only 10 years. So that's the difference. Huh? It's not really important. It's just a question of timing. If the one effect is bigger, they have been both there, as Joerg Bibow rightly said, they have been both there, and it's a question of timing. Whenever you have a devaluation, we really had a real devaluation inside the monetary union, you need a revaluation, an appreciation sooner or later. As I said, it's not important whether it's 10 or 20 years, but it has to come. So the rebalancing has to come in one way or the other, and it is not coming in Europe. It's not coming up in the Eurozone, and that is the major problem. But we discussed it later on. Just an answer to Norman's question. I disagree with all the other speakers on that, because I think there's one common feature that is overlooked here, which is extremely important, namely that we have monetary policy in Europe and in the United States and in Japan, for example, that is desperately fighting to get the economy out of the recession or back onto a normal growth path, and it's not working. So maybe there's something in common behind that, and in my view, it's on the labor market that prevents revival of domestic demand as we had it in former cycles and normal cycles. The normal cycle does not exist anymore because we have a depression on the wage side, a depression on the expectation of average households concerning their future income that makes our lives so difficult, and that's why we cannot only do it by fiscal policy, but by intervention into the labor market. Thank you.
We've got a question from Jonas right here, who, as a co-organizer of the conference, is allowed to jump the queue.
Oh my goodness, an unwarranted privilege. Well, I'll be brief. One statement and then one question for Joerg. Beginning with a statement, I think that all four of you, except Tom, are completely right. Tom is spectacularly right, but I'm focusing on the four of you because each one of you has a particular idea. So yes, Kunibert is addressing, I suspect, the issue of the debt overhang, which Joerg is not addressing. London is perfectly right that some new social contract is absolutely necessary, where ownership of the fiscal affairs of nation states has to be claimed on condition of a new deal for Europe, whereby certain areas like debt, investment, banking problems are Europeanized. And Joerg is absolutely right that we have states without central banks and the central bank without the state having its back. But now, Joerg, I'm going to address you and your idea. I have no doubt that a euro treasury will have to come in at some point. But at the same time, I also have no doubt that it will not be what we now need to stabilize the Eurozone. And it's a question of political feasibility. I mean, you rightly said that the German finance minister is going to torture the data as much as is necessary in order to produce the result that there's no scope for increasing wages in Germany, even though this is not true. Similarly, I do not believe that the political elites in Germany, or actually in the rest of the Eurozone, are ready for taxation without representation, for a situation where a segment of taxes will be siphoned off to a euro treasury that has no political and democratic legitimacy. I don't think it will be enough, even if they agreed to do that in order to reverse the crisis, because let's not forget that we have a crisis. Your proposal doesn't take account of the fact that we have a huge problem with the non-banking union. We have banking systems that are failing utterly, and there is absolutely no plan whatsoever for arresting this credit crunch, which is now developing asymmetrically in Europe. So a solution would have to deal with that. It would have to deal with the debt overhang, and it would have to use existing institutions. That's what some of us in this room believe. But now let me just come to the question. If I got it right, you are proposing that there should be no discretion in the creation of the euro treasury, that there should be a fixed rule, a pre-agreed rule, 3% of expenditures, investment expenditures in particular, a certain percentage of taxation, and then that would be redistributed in relation to GDP shares within the Eurozone, and member states will be cut off if they don't manage to balance their structural deficits. Now, what happens if, firstly, first question is, when you mention the word structural, are you not introducing through the back door a lot of discretion? Because as we know, this is in the eye of the beholder, what constitutes a structural deficit. And secondly, let's say that a country like Portugal or Greece, or for that matter, Ireland, fails. Once it has contributed a stream of its very precious tax take going to the Euro Treasury, would you cut them off at that point, especially in a Europe that has no democratic accountability of that Euro Treasury?
George, we'll go ahead and let you take that first, and then the other panelists can respond as well. And we're coming up on the end of the panel here, so unfortunately, with the debate of our austerity, we are operating under some chronological austerity here. Okay, go ahead.
My turn?
Yes.
Okay. You rightly emphasize political feasibility. We don't have a political union, and therefore we can't have a proper fiscal union. So the kind of fiscal union I propose, my treasury, as you rightly say, is a fixed rule. There's no discretion there. Investment grants and taxation are based on countries' GDP shares. So we rule out the redistribution part because we can't have the redistribution part without a political union. But I do think we can agree on this kind of fixed rule, which doesn't include redistribution, as soon as members understand that it's to everyone's benefit. To everyone's benefit in the sense that everybody's going to share the low borrowing costs that the Euro Treasury securities will deliver, and by securing the common infrastructure investment that actually everybody's talking about, including the European Commission. When they talk about Europe 2020, they identify massive needs for public investment. But they just don't have a proper plan how to actually do it. They talk about it. So my plan is kind of starting there, and it's a means to actually make it happen based on Euro Treasury securities as the funding. So very straightforward. When it comes to political feasibility, I see the same issues applying to your proposal, simply because your proposal includes a massive redistribution, and I think there is no possibility of that at this point. I mean, it's not that I'm not proposing my plan as the ideal world. The ideal world would be a proper fiscal union, but we can't have that now. So I'm talking here in practical terms. What is feasible? Structural current budget. Remember, we're cutting out the capital budget, the public investment pooled at the center, every country getting its share of the grants, and countries are from now on balancing their structural current budgets.
So if Greece doesn't manage to balance that structural budget, even if it has contributed a segment of its tax stake into the Euro Treasury, it's cut off.
Strictly speaking, well, there are some details which I haven't had a chance to, to spell out here. This is the risk sharing part in it. If there are asymmetric shocks, proper asymmetric shocks, part of the scheme should be temporary transfers. And this is actually the part that everybody is now agreeing on. The Commission's proposal, the four presidents' proposal, the Padua-Schioppa group, the IMF, everybody has this risk-sharing element in it. So if Greece is suffering because of an asymmetric shock, Greece may not be penalized because it would, as part of the Treasury plan, it would actually get support through this risk-sharing element, which I did not talk about in my plan. But otherwise, in principle, if there is a common shock and every member state is obligated to balance their structural current budget, and everybody does, but Greece doesn't, then Greece would be penalized in the sense of seeing a cut in their investment grants. You're right, absolutely. So this is the discipline. It's not the kind of discipline you get through the Stability and Growth Pact, which is non-credible and can't be worked, but you definitely can cut, and it would be automatic. There would be no discretion. Countries would agree on those rules, and would suffer the cuts if they don't behave according to the rules.
All right, mindful of time, I want to give each of our panelists a chance to offer any closing thoughts or responses, and then we'll wrap up the panel. So, Professor Ferguson, you first.
I think the sort of thing you got to keep your eye on is the deepening political crisis in Europe. This is, newspapers don't typically write about this until it becomes manifested in some, as it did in France, a victory in a local election by the National Front. But the real lesson from the 1930s and other experiences, but especially the 30s, is that if you cannot get a population back to work within a reasonable amount of time, the whole political system will turn upside down. My reading is that it is in the process of this. It's been slowed down by existing political rules, the democratic deficit in the European Union, which was set up to do that right at its origins. If I had time, I think it's an easy case to make. And then, of course, the sort of huge concentration of media, most of which just parrots the official line plus some semi-official critics. But it is actually happening. The world's real, and best not to take your eyes off that.
Thanks. I know.
I just want to put in one word in favor of empirical analysis, because here I heard the Bundesbank comes out with a paper that shows the opposite and so on. We really have to look at the type of analysis that's done there. There are basically two approaches out there that look at the determination of trade balances. You can either use trade elasticities, which give you very flimsy estimates, or you use structural macroeconomic models where all the results are entirely conditional on the model being true, or you use my method, which is very simple. And that's the key point about this method, that you actually don't need all the complexity of the previous analysis.
Well, first I have a question. Do I understand you right that all the investment budget would then be done by the central treasury, and there would be no more investment outlays in the budget of the member states?
In principle, yes, although I included the 0.5%, which is now in the medium-term objectives, if countries want to use that for investment, right? And then there would still be the structural funds coming from the EU budget. So understand, the Treasury is separate from the EU budget, right? So EU budget, that's a different story. So there could be more investment there. I'm just thinking...
But not in the member states?
Unless member states want to do more investment and finance it by taxation.
Okay, they can.
Yeah.
Thank you. But then I have another problem, which is the low interest rates of such common bonds in whichever, dress they might appear. Because the opposite might also be true. Because everyone knows that the amount of member countries that really can guarantee for the money is quite relatively small. It's not all the member states of the Eurozone, to put it in this way. And if these few countries get more and more guarantees and burden on them, the interest rate of, say, a Eurobond or of your bonds might be maybe even higher rather than lower. That's a possibility which... that's a possibility one has to think of. It's not by necessity so that a common issuance of bonds would necessarily lead to lower interest rates. Unless, of course, you compare it with crisis interest rates, I don't know, in Spain or so, then, of course, nearly anything is lower, but in the long run. And so I'm a bit skeptical about it. I cannot prove it because it's counterfactual. We don't have it yet, so we can only assume it is this way or that way. But I just think that is a danger which might materialize. It need not materialize, but it might not materialize. And the second point is that this way or that way, you have to get rid of the debt overhang. And therefore, I come back to pleading for a state insolvency mechanism. And the last remark, which I often make also in my lectures at home to my students, if I have a bailout, so to say, or a help, as in the case of Greece, and the moment they come and help you, your illness, so to say, is 120%, and after they have helped you for some year, it's 180%, then I ask myself, is this really help or is it destruction? You know, if you enter the hospital with one limb broken and you come out after they have helped you with all your limbs broken, I would not call this real help or rescue. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Landon.
Sorry, I think I need to come back directly on this because there's a serious mistake here.
Can you do it in 30 seconds or less?
No.
Okay,
Then
all
I
right.
wait until he's
resume it over the coffee. And anyone, when you see these two talking over coffee, please go eavesdrop. It'll be very interesting. So, all right, Landon.
So I guess just on that last point, I mean, I just hope that the powers that be, wherever they are, can look at this with an open mind and respect what these countries have gone through with regards to improving their fiscal condition, and do whatever it takes to allow them to take ownership of having done this, and not to say it was because Brussels or the Troika did it, and that as a result, somehow, there's a carrot involved with regard to helping, showing what the whatever federal institution, Germany, semi-federal, can do. And again, it has to do with the debt. But you know, conditionality is not a bad word as some people make it. So I would end with that. And time for coffee, right?
Well, Jamie's going to shoot me for this, but George, you can't have that 30 seconds after that sort of special appeal to the higher court. All right, okay.
Just to clean up the confusion which exists there. The typical Eurobond proposals have it backed by the member states. Yes. And the point is that, in principle, Germany is in the same position as Greece because the German Treasury does not have a central bank by its side anymore. The markets don't quite understand this point here. There's the safe haven status Germany enjoys. The Euro Treasury I'm proposing is very different because it's backed by the Treasury's power to tax. And it's backed by the fact that the ECB is side by side with the Euro Treasury. It's a fundamentally different position.
Okay, all right. Please join me in thanking our panelists for getting us off.